roads leading to Jesus. From the very beginning of Genesis, in the creation story, all the way to the story of Adam and Eve and the promises made to them about the seed who will stomp the serpent's head. All of these things point to Jesus, and he is the center. So when you say in the Old Testament, where's Jesus? He's everywhere, really, and all the roads point to Jesus as you walk through the pages of the Old Testament, and then you discover him being revealed in the Gospels, and then what he has done throughout history. And so we keep that in mind as we read through Micah in particular, but also anytime you're reading the Old Testament, you need to be looking for Jesus because he is there. So tonight we're going to dive in. This is going to be really about what it's going to be like under the rule of Christ during the millennium, and we're going to take a look at that. And it's also really neat because this is also a big part of the Christmas story in Micah chapter 5. I didn't plan it that way, but God did because he knew that I would be speaking on this subject, so it falls at a good time as we head through this Christmas season. And so let's start with chapter 5, verse 1, and it says this: "Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek." Now this starts off with the word "now," which suggests that this is an event that will happen soon after this prophecy is given. The thing is that the southern kingdom is about to fall into the hands of the Babylonians. The northern kingdom is probably during this time going to fall to the Syrians. The Syrians were in power. The Babylonians would be the ones who eventually become in power. And so you actually see chapter 5, verse 1 being fulfilled in 2 Kings 25. So if you want to know more about how all the prophecies worked out in Micah, you can go read in 2 Kings and the destruction of Jerusalem, and you discover what happened. So you find this particular verse really played out in 2 Kings 25. The leader of Judah at this time is King Zedekiah. He is the person that is referred to as the judge of Israel, and he is struck on the cheek. And the strike on a cheek is an act of humiliation. If you think about movies you've seen, when somebody gets slapped on the cheek, typically in the Old Testament times, and even when Jesus lived, a typical slap on the cheek was a backhand. I don't know if your parents ever backhand you. I hope not. I've never backhand my children, nor my wife, or anybody else I can think of. But if you do backhand somebody, what that typically means is an act of humiliating them. And what it does is it says, hey, I have dominion and authority over you. And so it's a slap on the cheek. If you remember the scene from The Godfather, the Godfather slaps a few people on the cheek as he is letting them know they have authority over them. So what this is implying is the king of Jerusalem will be humiliated, and that's exactly what happened in 2 Kings 25. And after the fall of Jerusalem, so the Babylonians place a siege on the city of Jerusalem. So the idea to muster your troops but is that Jerusalem would draw their troops in and they would be ready for battle, but they would be overcome by the Babylonian siege. After Zedekiah was captured by the Babylonians, when they had a breach in the wall around Jerusalem, and when that breach occurred and the Babylonians came into the city, the king Zedekiah and his family took off on the run, and they actually caught them on the plains of Jericho. And when they got Zedekiah, they beat him down, and then they held him in captive. And what they did to him was they took all of his sons, and they killed them in front of him on the plains of Jericho. And then they poked out his eyes. So the last thing that Zedekiah saw was his own sons being killed right in front of him. So he spent his life remembering this is the last thing that he actually saw with his eyes. Pretty brutal thing that happened in those days. And so then he was carried off to Babylon, where he eventually passed away. And so what we have is this really bad news about what's going to happen to the southern kingdom and Judah and Jerusalem. But there is good news on the horizon. And so then we move into the Christmas story. Whenever you see in verse 2, there's a but there that's telling you there's something to be contrasted. So you got some really bad news, and then here comes the good news. So let's take a look at verse 2. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, that's a hard word to say, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, and whose coming forth is from old, from the Ancient of Days. And so this is a lot for us to dive into, so I want to spend some time here. In the Scriptures, you get bad news and you get good news. Anybody ever come to you and say, hey, I got good news and bad news. Which one do you want first? What do you usually ask for? Well, give me the bad news first. He wants to get that out of the way. And so God seems to me to communicate to us in the very similar way that he gives us the bad news and then he gets the good news. So, for example, in this prophecy, you get the bad news. Jerusalem's going to fall. Israel's going to be overthrown. They're going to be taken into exile. The king's going to be humiliated. But that's not the end of the story. The good news is that God is going to raise up a new king who's going to overthrow and become the king that was promised to King David and take on have an eternal throne. And so we understand this. So you get the bad news, but the good news is that God's not done with Israel and that he leaves us with hope. And that seems to be the way God works all throughout the Scriptures, is you get a warning of bad news to come, but there is good news because God is at work even in the bad news. So the gospel works like that for us, doesn't it? We find out that we are sinners and that God's wrath, we are deserving of that to be poured out on our lives. But God demonstrated his love, Romans 5:8, while we were still sinners. Christ died for us, and so we have this gift offered to us through Jesus Christ. You get the bad news. If you don't get the bad news, then the good news ain't really that great. But if you understand the bad news, then you go, hey, this is great news that Jesus Christ will die for me. And so instead of getting the wrath of God, we get the grace of God through Jesus Christ, and it's real and it's hopeful. The real part of it is the bad news. The hopeful part of it is the good news. And so that's what we get in the gospel. Now, says to Israel, hey, Bethlehem, which is the house of bread, and then Ephrathah is the a place of abundance. And so the focus is on, we usually just talk about Bethlehem. Where was Jesus born? He was born in Bethlehem. And often that was confusing for the people in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, because Jesus, they knew that the Messiah was to come to Bethlehem, but whenever they met Jesus, he was from where? He was from Nazareth. And so it's a little bit confusing for them, but he was born in Bethlehem, this house of bread, and that was where he was born. But he ended up growing up, and he went to Egypt, and then he went to Nazareth, where he grew up in Galilee. Now, Bethlehem being that house of bread, it's also, like I said, it's the home of King David. King David was born in Bethlehem. It's a small town about 5 miles outside of Jerusalem. It was a really small and insignificant town. It becomes significant throughout history because David is born there, and then more importantly, Jesus is born there. And so that's why it becomes a very important city in our lives, is because of who was born there. So this prophecy that is laid out in verse 2 concerning the Messiah, think about this. This prophecy is given approximately 400 years before Jesus is ever going to be born. So God speaks through the prophet to tell the people there's bad news. You guys are going to be overthrown, taken to exile. But the good news is that I'm going to send one who's going to become the king. He's going to be the Messiah that you look for. He's going to be born in Bethlehem. So they get this promise of good to come. And it's 400 years before it ever happens. That's a pretty amazing thing. So it's not only just a prophecy that things are going to happen in the future, but it's also the promise that they would need, that God was not done with them yet, that God had a king, that he was going to keep his promise to Abraham, that he was going to keep his promise to David, that God was going to fulfill his covenant to his people. Now, 400 years before Christmas, that's when this was given. And so we know that Christmas occurred. I want to go to Matthew real quick, Matthew chapter 2. Matthew is the gospel writer who is in particular writing to the Jews to let them know who Jesus is. And so his point in that is to write specifically to a Jewish audience to say, The one that you've been looking for, the one that you've hoped for is Jesus. And so when we get to the Christmas story in chapter 2, I want you to hear the words, Matthew 2, verses 1 through 7. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. In assembling all the chief priests, this is important, he assembled all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, and he inquired of them where was the Christ, which is the Messiah, was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it was written by the prophet. And then you read the prophecy in Micah 5:2, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, and by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And so here's what was going on. So the people in Jesus' day at the time of his birth, they understood Micah 5:2 to be a prophecy of the Messiah and the day that he was born and when he would show up and where he would show up. And so they were looking for this. So the men from the east, probably from the area of Persia, were looking for this star. So the star showed up. So Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and as being born in Bethlehem, he is a baby. But by the time that they get there, Jesus is probably no longer a baby. He's probably a toddler, and he is already, once Herod finds out it, because Herod's going to want to kill him, it gets on the way to Egypt. And so what you have is they get there and they show up. And so what Herod ends up doing is saying all children, all baby boys under 2 are to be slaughtered. And so what you have is this understanding of this verse from the Old Testament is not just us reading back into the Old Testament. This is what they believed as Jews, the chief priests and the scribes, the lawyers who worked at the temple, understood that this was where the Messiah would be born. And so it's important to recognize that Jesus was born there. And so John chapter 6, verse 35, where you have Jesus speaking of himself, which I find very interesting. And he says of himself, he said to them, I'm the bread of life, and whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes me shall never thirst. And so what Jesus says, and remember, he's born in Bethlehem, which is the house of bread. Jesus says, I am the bread of life, because bread was something that physically sustained life. When the Israelites left Egypt and they went on the Exodus, they began to complain because they didn't have enough food to eat. And so God sent them manna, which is a form of bread. And so they learned that they had to get bread, and God had situated it so that God would make manna be there in the morning. They would go collect it, and for every day they had to go collect daily bread. If they kept it overnight, then it would go bad, have maggots in it, and they would have to throw it out. Then on the Sabbath, they'd actually get 2 days' worth, and somehow God was working miraculously, so it lasted 2 days and not just 1 day. But the point being was that they would need daily bread. So here comes Jesus, and he says, I'm the bread of life. And he's saying, I'm the one who sustains you. So I'm not just the life bread for physical life. I'm the life bread for eternal life. And so Jesus is saying that he is from the house of bread, that he is the bread for all men. Matter of fact, bread is so much important to all of the culture, is that when Jesus is tempted by Satan, Jesus quotes the Old Testament and said, man does not live by bread alone, but every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. One of the interesting components of that is Jesus saying, look, you need bread for physical nourishment, but you need the word for spiritual nourishment. And even to carry that even further is to say, Jesus in John's gospel is known as the Word. You need the Word made flesh, Jesus, and you need the Word of God. And Jesus is the greatest revelation of who God is. And so when you see him, that's why we call him the Word. He is the Word made flesh. We live by following Jesus. We live by living and eating the bread of life, which is Jesus. And so it sustains our life, not just for now, but all eternity. And so there's a lot going on in this verse at Christmas time. Judah says he's from the clan of Judah. We know that the Messiah would come from the tribe of Judah, and each tribe had clans, and Bethlehem was a small portion of that. And we know that Jesus was going to be a part of this group. And so one of the applications for this is just simply, if you really want to dive down into this, how does this apply? You may think that you are small, but the great news about Bethlehem is it's a small place, but God does extraordinary things with it. In other words, we could say it like this: it's a small place, but God does big things. And so that's important for us because we live in a small town. And you say, was anything ever significant happen in Douglas, Georgia? And the answer is yes. God's always up to doing something great. And a lot of times it comes from small things and small places. And so, if you think about the greatest king of all time will be Jesus. And then you have David. You have great kings coming from this little tiny place called Bethlehem. And so what you discover as you read Micah chapter 5 is that Jesus is the center. Like, that's why I say he's like, if there was a map, in the Bible was a map, it would be all the roads leading to one place, to Jesus. And that's, Jesus is the plan. Jesus is the center of that. We'll go back to this past Sunday. It was talking about Galatians chapter 4. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his son. So God sent forth his son. He was born of a woman, and he was born under the law. What that means is everything had to be just right in history, that God was orchestrating history to this point. And why that's big is if you flip to Luke chapter 2, to the Christmas story, and I know a lot of us will be reading the Christmas story to our kids, and sometimes we miss these elements of it, but this is really, really cool how this works out. So Luke chapter 2, verse 1 says this: in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus. So here is Caesar Augustus, he's the Roman emperor, that all the world should be registered. So there's going to be a census. This was the first registration of Quirinius, who was the governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. So Joseph went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was a child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. And so what you see, what's really exciting about this is God is orchestrating history, and God is even using a pagan king to do what he wants to accomplish. So he moves Caesar Augustus to do this census. It goes out to all the world. And the reason Joseph and Mary were in Bethlehem was not because they lived there. It was because his family was there, and he had to go back there to register. And God had planned it just at the right time so that when they got there, Mary gave birth to Jesus. And if you think about what all had to happen for that to happen, it's pretty remarkable. But that's God. Everything that he plans happens the way that he wants it to happen. So much so that he can say something's going to happen 400 years before it ever does. And you could say, I don't see any way that could take place. Like if you were a human, look at that, you go, no way. And it's dead on. Even using a pagan king. Pretty remarkable. So Jesus was the plan from the very beginning of time for this to take place. From Bethlehem, there was going to be a ruler to reign and have dominion. He would rule. It says that he would come and he would be ruler in Israel, not just over Israel, that he's going to rule the whole world. And then it says, whose coming forth is from old, from the Ancient of Days. And I want to spend a moment on this because I think it's important for us in understanding our study of Christ, what we call Christology. The Ancient of Days is Jesus. He is the going out or coming forth is from old, means from the beginnings, and that is that he is before creation. So Genesis 1:1, In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. That means in the beginning that there was no time. There was just, I don't even know what you call that. But there was no time. It was just eternity. Eternity past. And then there was a beginning. And then there was time. And then there was space, heavens. And then there was earth. And so it was created. And then when you go to John 1:1, what you see is this creation account. John writes a similar creation account, and here's what he says. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. So Jesus was with God, and the Word, Jesus, was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him. And without him was not anything made that was made. In other words, here's what blows your mind. So Jesus, he didn't start in Bethlehem. Jesus has always been, will always be. Revelation says that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega. He is, we would say, he is the beginning and the end. Alpha and Omega are the beginning of the Greek alphabet and the end of the alphabet. He is, in our terminology, he is A to Z. So, in other words, Christ didn't just start existing when he was in Bethlehem and he took on flesh. So John 1:14 says, the Word took on flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled among us. So God moved in the neighborhood. It wasn't that God has not always been with us because he's omnipresent. But what happened was Jesus took on flesh, the Son of God, and he came to earth, which was the plan all along, to come to the earth for the glory of God and for the salvation of men. And so he came, and he's known as the Ancient of Days, which is literally, the translation would be days of immeasurable time. And so, in other words, Jesus has always been. And then what Jesus did, he who was outside of time did what? Stepped into time, walked among us, lived among us, was a baby, grew up, lived his life perfectly, died on the cross, rose again, ascended back into heaven. He was God, and he still is God. And so that's what you get when you talk about Jesus and understanding who he is. Let me go to Paul and read this to you, because this all should just really blow all of our minds, trying to wrap your head around the greatness of God, the majesty of God, the majesty of Jesus. So Paul writes, and he says this. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him and all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So he was before all things, but all things exist because he made them exist, and he's actually the glue that holds it all together. And so that's who Jesus is. Now, that's a lot to get out of verse 2, I know. But that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to who Jesus is. And so, we need to think about who Jesus is more often. So we know that Christmas has come, and we celebrate that. So then verse 3, we start entering in. So therefore, what's going to happen when Jesus comes? And so the prophecy is Jesus is going to come the first Advent, and then he's going to have a second coming. And that second coming is when we're going to see these events unfold. And so what's going to happen when he comes? And so I want to give you 6 things out of this text that he's going to come. So I'll just read to you a few of these verses, and we'll kind of walk back through them. Therefore, he, Jesus, we would say the Messiah, shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth, then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. So what we discover is that God is going to allow his people to be overthrown by the Babylonians and be taken into exile and scattered among the nations. And that's exactly what took place. Until eventually one day they are going to return to be a great nation again under the rule of God. And so he says, but until that time, they're going to be scattered out. And then he who has scattered them is going to gather them back from all the places of the world. The nation of Israel is going to come together under the Messiah. So Jesus is going to be the one who restores the nation of Israel to the glory that God had for them. Then, secondly, Jesus will lead them as a shepherd over his flock. So he says, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord and the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. So Jesus is going to lead them himself. It's not going to be somebody standing in for him. He's going to stand and he's going to shepherd his people. He's going to be over the flock. Jesus revealed in John 10:11, he says, I am the good shepherd. And so Jesus is saying that he is going to shepherd his people, the nation of Israel, and lead them as a nation. He will lead them how? By the strength of the Lord. So it's going to be in the power of God that he's going to lead. So he's going to be in charge, and he's going to have authority over them as a shepherd. And then what he's going to do is lead in the strength, and he will also lead them in the name of the majesty of Jehovah Elohim, which is the Lord your God. And which means he's going to rule over them with the character of God. And so he's going to be holy and just and loving and good. So when we get Jesus as king, so we're Americans, and why we left England because we don't like the king. That's why we established a country. We don't want a king. We don't want a monarchy. But here's the issue. One day you and I are going to be in a monarchy. As a matter of fact, I would offer to you, if you're a follower of Christ, you're in a monarchy right now. You have one king, and Jesus is that king. And you say, well, I don't like monarchies. Well, that's the way it's going to be. And so, like, when we get to heaven, there's not going to be, voting, like we get to vote on what gets done, and we don't like the king. Look, here's the great thing about Jesus. Jesus is the good shepherd, but he's also the good king, meaning Jesus is a dictator. Like, we are a dictator, we like, wow, man, that's like the worst kind of leader. But the reality of him being dictator is that he's perfectly holy and he's perfectly loving. So he is a good and benevolent dictator, and that everybody who's under his leadership is going to love it because he is a good shepherd. He looks after his flock, which means he presides over them, he provides for them, and he protects them. And that's who Jesus is as king. I'm signing up. I want to be a part of that. I want a perfect leader. Not like we have today. It doesn't matter who we put in office. They're going to be flawed in some way. But Jesus is not flawed. He's perfect. And he leads through the character of the Father. The other thing. So, and they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. And so what Jesus is going to give the nation of Israel is security. Now, never been to Israel, but I've kept tabs on Israel. If anybody probably feels a little insecure in the world, they probably do. I mean, if you think about the United States, I mean, our enemies we have a huge barrier between us and most of our enemies. It's called an ocean. And it's hard to cross that ocean, even with all the technology we have. But there's a sense that, Canada and Mexico, yeah, people could come up through that, but like, we feel secure in our borders. Now, Israel, on the other hand, has historically always been this way. As a nation, they are sitting in the middle of all of their enemies. Everybody around them wants their land and wants them dead. And so what Jesus, as king, is going to do is he's going to give them the security that they have longed for. He's going to make them secure. And how he's going to do it, it says, he shall be great to the ends of the earth. So in other words, when Jesus becomes king of Israel, he's not just going to be king over that nation. He's going to be over all the nations. He's going to rule all. So it's to the ends of the earth. So like when you read, taking the gospel to the ends of the earth, what does that mean? It means, hey, we're going to take it to every nation. We're going to go to every people group. We're going to take this all over the world. And what this is Israel's going to have security, and it's going to be global security because Jesus is the king. That's a pretty cool thing. And then it says in verse 5, he shall be their peace. So not only will Jesus give them security with his global dominion, Jesus will be their peace. So in other words, this is an interesting phrase to me. Jesus will not only give them peace, He is their peace. He's the embodiment of peace. And so we know that, the Jewish word for that is shalom. So, peace be with you. When Jesus is with you, he is shalom. And so Jerusalem itself is the city of peace. And then you're going to have the King of Peace, the Prince of Peace, ruling from the throne. And so they are going to have peace because they have Jesus. What does that mean? So Mark chapter 4, there's a story where the disciples are going to go over the Sea of Galilee, and they're in a boat. And as they're traveling on the boat, Jesus is asleep, and a storm comes up. Remember the story? Jesus is, he's crashed out. He don't even know there's a storm. He does because he's God, but if you're a disciple, you're like, Jesus, y'all somebody need to wake Jesus up because we're fixing to all drown in this boat. Jesus ain't worried about the storm. And so they get Jesus up, and what does he do? He stands up and he speaks to the wind and the waves, and they still. Jesus was their peace. Literally, he was their peace. He was in the boat with them, and so they had peace. And that's who Jesus is, and that's who he is for the nation of Israel. Not only that, it says when the Syrian comes into our land, remember the Syrians are the great power of the day when Micah's writing this. They have no idea that the Babylonians are going to rise up and overthrow them. And treads in our palaces, and then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men. And they shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod as entrances, and he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and treads within our border. So Jesus will give them peace, but he also will give them victory over the nations. No threat will be big enough or strong enough to come into the nation of Israel and take them over, like the Assyrians have done the northern kingdom and like Babylon will do to the southern kingdom. When Jesus is reigning, there is real no threat to the city of Jerusalem nor the nation. And not only that, it says that Jesus will give them authority over the nations. And so it says they shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. So Assyria is an example of the enemies of Israel. So like if you went today, where is Assyria? Syria is really probably northern part of Iraq. It's really a northern part. We call Persia like Iran, and so you've got these different nations, but it's that area that surrounds Israel, and these are the greatest threats. And so eventually these places will not be a threat because Jesus will be the chief shepherd, and he will have his people that he put in place to shepherd those nations. So he's not really ever at threat, or the nation at threat. And it makes this reference to the land of Nimrod. Now, Nimrod was a descendant of Ham. If you remember, Noah had 3 sons. Not Seth, that's Adam's replacement for Abel. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so Ham is the one who was rebellious, and so he got cursed, and then eventually led to Nimrod being the son of one of the sons of Ham. And he was known in Genesis 10 as a skillful hunter. And he's also, the Bible doesn't say this, but most scholars and historians believe that Nimrod was the leader. We know that he was the leader of the city of Shinar, and he was also the one who was responsible for building the Tower of Babel. And so Nimrod literally means to rebel. And so Nimrod is a probably synonym for Assyria, the nations that rebel against God. They do not obey God. They do not follow God. And so, today, I don't know, I ain't heard anybody use it, but I know growing up, people used to call people Nimrods. And it's really interesting because if you think about it, well, why do people call people Nimrods? So if you don't know anything about Genesis 10, you're like, I don't get the reference, And so, it's kind of biblical slang. And so, if you call somebody a Nimrod, what are you saying? They're an idiot, they're a fool. And the idea is most likely when you rebel against God, you are foolish. And so by building a tower to try to reach heaven, then you are doing something foolish. And so Nimrod, if he actually was the one who built the city, it was a foolish thing to do. And so these other nations, so the land of Assyria and the land of Nimrod are really synonymous for the same thing as the nations who do not bow to Jesus, but they are not a threat to Jesus as king and to the nation as a whole of Israel. And so these under shepherds will be put in charge of these other nations. So it's, how shepherds work. There's a chief shepherd and there are under shepherds. So these others will take place. It would be like at a church, you have a senior pastor, then you have associate pastors. So Jesus is the chief shepherd, and then he'll have other shepherds who are over these other places in the world. So Micah chapter 7. I need to slow down. I'm going too fast. So is where we talk a little bit more about the remnant that has come. So verse 7. Then the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many people, like the dew from the Lord, like the showers on the grass, which delay not for a man, nor wait for the children of men. So what we discover is that the remnant of Jacob will be large and triumphant as it returns back to Israel. So God's going to restore the nation. Like dew and rain is a reference to how wide this will be. It will cover all of the whole area. It will be widespread. So in other words, all these Jews that are scattered out among the nations are going to be brought back underneath Jesus to be king. And that this reference to dew is in Israel, the land was nourished and refreshed by dew during the months, I believe, April to October. And then from, or April to September, then October to March, it was showers. So that's how God would nourish the land. And so it's a reference to the whole area being brought back together. And it says, in God's time and in God's doing. In other words, God has a perfect timing that he's working out through history. We can't always see it. God gives us, let's say, hints about what is to come. And so when we study the scripture and we see things like prophecies, we understand those prophecies to be foretelling of what is to come, but also a promise. And it's a promise to Israel that God's not done with them, that he's going to bring them all back together. Then he makes a reference to them in the next verse with the same lines, if you notice, in remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations in the midst of many people. So you have the Israelites scattered out among the nations. They're going to be brought back together. And then it says, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, and like a young lion among the flocks of the sheep, which when it goes through, treads down and tears in pieces, and there is none to deliver. So, you don't have to be a scholar to kind of get the idea there. So the idea is that, hey, you got Israel that's scattered out. God's going to bring them together. They're going to be like a lion or a young lion, and they're going to go through. And so what happens when you have a lion and a sheep together? The lion is going to tear up that sheep. And that's what Israel's going to do. So under God's command, they are going to be victorious under Jesus, under the Messiah. So this is so when you get to the Gospels and you wonder what was Judas and what did they believe about Jesus? Well, they were convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. So in their minds, what were they thinking? If Jesus is the Messiah, then what's going to happen? He's going to raise up an army, and we're going to destroy all these people, and especially Rome. We're going to take Rome down because that's who the Messiah is. But they didn't understand that the Messiah was to be born, then he was to live a perfect life, then die and sacrifice his life for their sake, and that they didn't see all the other stuff that was going to happen before Jesus as king rules over all the nations. And so this all happens in God's timing, but they will be unstoppable. You remember when David was a young shepherd, before he went to fight Goliath, and he came up and he said, who's this uncircumcised Philistine that he would defy the armies of God? And they were like, well, who are you, boy? I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what they said. And he said, I'm a servant of God. And he said, I've been a shepherd. And then they basically they're like, what's your resume? What you ever done? You ever been in a fight? Because Goliath is about 9 feet tall, and he's a warrior from his early days. So what you going to do with that? And then Daniel's comment is about, well, I've taken down a bear and a lion. Because lions were known to attack sheep. And so you get this picture that that Israel itself is going to be the lion, and it's going to be unstoppable and unconquerable. And that's what Jesus leading his people. So verse 9 says, your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries, and all your enemies shall be cut off. So what the prophecy is that Jesus is going to become king, and Israel's going to be victorious. Now, I don't know how many of you watch like professional boxing or wrestling or MMA or anything like that. But if you do, if you've ever just seen it, and you've seen it at the end when they, let's say, Mike Tyson's knocked out, whoever, and at the end of the match, they bring them both together, and the referee gets their hands, and they announce the winner, and they hold up the guy's hand. That's the picture that's right there. Your hand shall be lifted up. Boom, victorious. Adversary still laying on the ground, knocked out. That's the picture. With Jesus as king, they will be victorious. And so they get this picture. And then verse 10, in that day declares the Lord, I will cut off your horses from among you and will destroy your chariots. And I will cut off the cities of your land and throw down your strongholds. I will cut off sorceries from your hand, and you shall have no more tellers of fortune. I will cut off your carved images and your pillars among you, and you shall bow down no more to the work of your hands. I will root out your Asherah images from among you and destroy your cities. And in anger and wrath I will execute vengeance on the nations that did not obey. So what is the impact? They're going to have this future victory. What is the impact of Jesus' work? That day, Jesus will be exalted. He will be king. Second thing, there will be no more need for military. I will cut off your horses from among you and will destroy your chariots. One of the things in the Old Testament that is repeated is we don't trust in chariots or horses. We trust in the name of our Lord. So what the idea here is when Jesus is king, Israel will no longer need a military. That sink in. Because they have Jesus. Jesus doesn't need a military. He is the military. And so he is the law. And so interestingly enough, I will cut off your horses and destroy your chariots. And so in that day, I will cut off your cities from your land and throw down all your strongholds. In other words, you will not need any offensive weapons, chariots and horses, and you won't even, there's no need for strongholds. You won't have to have city walls anymore because Jesus is king, and there will be peace in the land. He rules over all, so there will be an end to military action. Lions will lay down with lambs. That's the picture. The other thing that will be gone is I will cut off sorceries from your hand, and you shall have no more tellers of fortune. So when you're driving down the street in Israel, you won't see the palm reader, stopping in with that red light flashing. So there will be no more of that, no more astrologers and all these sorts of things. And so I will cut off your carved images from your sacred pillars. You'll bow down no more to the work of your hands. And so this will be the end of idolatry. So in Israel, there will be no more witchcraft. There will be no more occult practices in the land. There will be no more fortune tellers, no more carved images, no more sacred pillars, no more bowing down to idols. So like when I was in Africa, legit, they had idols that they worshipped, and they were carved of stone and wood, and they would worship them. They had a tree where they sacrificed animals. And so this still goes on today. And what Jesus is saying, when Jesus is king, no more of that will exist. And even to go on, because I thought this was really interesting, the reference, I will root out your Asherah images from among you, is a reference to Asherah was the Canaanite fertility goddess. So she was the goddess of sex, fertility, and war, prostitution. So I don't want to show you a picture of it, but you can Google this idol, and it's a woman basically holding up her breast. And so now you know I'm not showing it, but it's a carved statue, and so that's exactly what it is. And one of the things that historians say about Asherah as a goddess was that she is called the forgotten wife of Yahweh. In other words, what they believed is that she was actually the wife of God, and that she helped God in these things. And so it was a common practice, especially up until the days in Judah before the fall of Judah, where they actually would have these little statues in their homes where they worshiped them. So in other words, they would worship God, Yahweh, and then they would have these Asherah idols that they would worship too. And so in other words, when you go back to the Ten Commandments, what's the very first thing? You shall have no other gods before or beside God. So it's not just that you have a God before him, but you don't even have a God beside him. So God's not sharing his glory, and he's not sharing his glory with a forgotten wife either. And so, but that what was going on in Jerusalem. So now you understand why God's wrath is being poured out on his people, because they are forgetting who he is. And so this is why they will be taken into exile. And so you have this this idolatry that will be taken out of the nation. And so then you get the verse 15. In anger and in wrath I will execute vengeance on the nations that did not obey. What we know about God is this. We see this all throughout the Old Testament. God is patient and slow to anger. But that doesn't mean that he never gets angry. That doesn't mean that God doesn't ever have it up to here. You ever had it up to here? Eventually, God has it up to here, and when he does, for example, God had it up here with the world, and then he flooded it. That's the Noah story. God had it up to here with Sodom and Gomorrah, and then he burned it. There will come a time when God's had it up to here with the nations, and he will bring about his army, and Jesus himself will bring about vengeance and wrath upon the people. The good news about that is that justice will be served. If you ever wonder, will things be made right? The answer is yes. The judgment day that is to come is referred to as the great and terrible day. It's great for those who are in the mercy of God. It's awful for those who are not. It's great for the nation whose God is God. It's horrible for the nations who are against God in their rebellion. And so this is Micah chapter 5. This is the end of this second section. And what you discover is that Christmas came and that there is a future for God's people. And so real quick for application, I wanted to spend a moment on this because, it's not just enough for us to get information, and that's good. But we need to also make sure that we leave with some application. So I want to get you to think about the rule of Jesus now in your life. The things that the Israelites and the other nations struggle with is whether or not they were willing to obey God. So the question we have to ask is, am I obedient to Jesus? Jesus says that if you love him, then you'll obey him. So if I say I love Jesus, then I will want to do the things that please him. Not so that I earn his favor, but because I have his favor. I don't do it to get him to be gracious to me. I do it because he has been gracious to me. So the question I would ask in light of this is, am I consistently obeying Jesus? Another question we could ask out of this is, we've talked about security. Are you secure in Jesus? Where do you find your security in? Is it, hey, my bank account's growing larger? Find my security in a relationship that I have here on earth? What is it that you find your security in? So the Israelites will find their security in Jesus. So what makes you feel secure? Like, are you secure in who you are in Christ? Are you living fearfully? A third way to look at this, are you experiencing the peace of Jesus? Yeah, Jesus will be their peace. What is Jesus to you? If we say that we have Jesus, is he our shalom? Like, do we find peace no matter what's happening in our life, no matter what circumstance we've got, do we find peace in Jesus? If we say, Jesus is enough for me, is he really? Because we're Americans and we always want a little bit more. So where are we finding our peace? Another thing, so Jesus is going to bring victory to the Israelites. Are you walking in victory now? You are more, Paul says, more than conquerors through him who died for you. So you have victory, but the issue is, are you walking in victory, or are you living defeated? Are you living as Jesus never rose from the dead? Are you living as Jesus never conquered sin? And so that's a way that we can think about the victory we already have in Jesus. When I was probably in middle school, we went to this church, and we would, at the end of the service, there would always be an invitation. I know at Grace Point we don't always do an invitation. Well, we very seldom do an invitation. And one of the reasons for that is there's always an invitation. Holy Spirit's always working. We do think about a response, but I don't mean to get off on that, but I'm just saying there's always an invitation to the Lord, and if the Holy Spirit's drawing people, we feel confident that he will do that work. But at that church, growing up, for about 2 or 3 years we went there, every Sunday we sang the last song, Victory in Jesus. I would sing it for you, but you might not ever come back because I know it by heart. The issue is, are we walking in the victory that Jesus has already gotten for us? And then lastly, because he gives the Israelites authority over the nations, are you exercising the authority that Jesus is giving you by making disciples? In Matthew 28:19, Jesus tells his disciples to go and make disciples. He authorizes them to go to the nations. So they're over the nations in order to take the gospel to them. So one of the applications for us is, if we have the victory of Jesus and we've already won, then are we using the authority that he's won and gave us victory to go make disciples? So the question to you would be, in application, are you discipling people? Baptizing and teaching them the things that Jesus taught? If you're not, should you? And the answer is yes, you should. It's not just pastors who disciple people. If you are a follower of Christ, then you are to reproduce other followers of Christ so you make disciples. And it simply comes down to this. You might say, well, I don't really know what you know, Pastor. You don't need to know everything that I know. I forgot a lot of things I've known. See, discipleship, I heard it once said, and I think about it this way, and I think it'll encourage you. Discipleship ultimately is not about you filling up somebody else's cup. It's about you emptying yours. So if you've only been a Christian for 6 months, if you've only been a Christian for a year, if you've only been following Jesus for a short time, you are capable of discipling others in Christ. It's not about teaching them everything in the Bible because you know it all. It's about you taking what you know about Jesus and giving it to them so that they too can follow Jesus. There's not a moment where you go, I think I'm good now, I can disciple people. As soon as you follow Jesus, you're authorized to do it. And as you follow Jesus and you are his disciple, your cup will get more and more full. You'll get more and more knowledge. You'll get more and more faith. And as that fills, you'll be able to pour that in other people's lives. So you don't have to go to seminary and get a Bible degree. You just have to follow Jesus. And what you know about Jesus right now is more than most of the world knows. Promise you. Because there are parts of the world have never even heard of Jesus. So what you know might be, you might feel like, well, I just got a little bit in there. Here's the good news of the gospel. That's how you make disciples. It just takes knowing what? There was a Christmas. There was a Good Friday. And there was an Easter. And that one man, who was God, changed everything. You know that. Do you share it? With that, let's pray. Father, thank you for your grace toward us. Thank you that your promises are true, that your prophecy will come to fruition. And we'll celebrate these things with you. And we are honored to be in your kingdom. And though the earthly kingdom is not established in this moment, in history it already is. And we love being in your kingdom and having you as our king. Help us to apply these things to our life so that we might glorify you. And we love you. In Jesus'